Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Welcome, Sebastien.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Today we have author Sebastien de Castell. I'll probably get that wrong, so say it for us, please.
There's no wrong way to say it, but I usually say it as Sebastien de Castell.
De Castell. Okay, thank you. You are primarily a fantasy writer, correct?
That's correct. Yep, I've had 18 fantasy novels published in, I guess, the last decade. That's when I started.
Wow, congratulations. That's very prolific. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with your most recent Play of Shadows, or do you want to go back to the beginning and start from there?
Whatever works, whatever you think best serves your listeners. I'm happy
Okay,
to.
well, let's talk about Play of Shadows.
Sure. So yeah, Play of Shadows, it's my latest novel. It's my 18th novel. It's set in the world of the Greatcoats, which is was my first four-book series about these swashbuckling magistrates who have to travel around the country and hear cases and often have to duel to enforce their verdicts. But if people haven't read that, this is a perfectly good place to start because it's a new main character, and it's a swashbuckling fantasy novel set in the theater, which sort of brings together two loves of mine. There was a period of time when I was doing fight choreography for theater productions, when I remember when I was working with actors and people who love theater or just love actors in general, uh, their process I always find so interesting, and the way that some actors will just kind of slide into a character at a level of intensity that almost feels magical. And one of the things I like to do as a fantasy novelist is I like to look at the world around me and ask, like, why do we have some things in our world but not other things, like cultural things? So for example, why do we have like a kind of a weird obsession with celebrities, right? Where we care about everything that they say and do, but we don't, let's say, have a tradition where we think, oh, well, some celebrity or some actors are so intense in their role that when they're playing the role, maybe they're really channeling the spirit of the characters that they're playing somehow, right? So just those weird sort of anthropological observations, or sociological. There was a great definition of sociology I once heard somebody say, which is sociologists try to make the everyday seem strange and the strange seem everyday. And so I kind of like to do that. And so with Play of Shadows, it's set in a city where people believe that certain actors that are called varistors are so masterful in their ability to portray a character that they actually channel the spirit of the historical figures that they're playing. And into this sort of world of theater comes the main character Damalas, who is in the process of fleeing a judicial duel, um, and because he knows he's going to lose and get killed, and he basically tries to hide out in a theater because there's an old law that says that an actor in one of the grand operatos, as they're called, can't be forced into an honor duel. And so he manages to get the other actors and the director to let him be a sort of a bit player, so that he can hide out, and not have to fight this duel. Except that all of a sudden, even though he's only a bit player on the stage at the end, as he's supposed to deliver these two very simple lines, something happens and he completely bungles the lines and starts spouting this completely treasonous accusation against one of the city's most legendary historical princes. And from there, Damalas enters into this very strange, shadowy world of slipping between two different time periods and finding out that there's a bunch of lies that people have been treating as sort of the truth of their own past. And there's conspiracies and these strange militias and a court of what's called the Court of Flowers who seem to be in control of everything. And so it comes down to Damalas and a group of misbegotten actors trying to figure out what really happened before their whole city is set afire in a civil war.
Interesting. So he does become this former prince who is now dead, right?
He in fact
For a
becomes the
time, he
villain.
does.
Uh, so he finds himself taken over, or he thinks, by the spirit of the villain.
Okay, sort
Um,
of like a possession. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, except that he has sort of some control over it. And so often some of the fun in the story is sort of him arguing with the spirit of this long dead Archduke Corbier, who is, from a different era and a different class of person. And so kind of looks down on Damelas for being, kind of cowardly and meek all the time and not, just going up and killing somebody who gets in his way. Um, and Damelas thinks of Archduke Corbier as this kind of very overly aggressive, brutish, snob. And but of course, one of the things that he discovers that a restore can do is he can draw on Corbier's memories of, for example, how to sword fight. And so suddenly, in some situations, he's a much better sword fighter than he would otherwise have been, but he's also got that bloodthirsty instinct. And so Damelas is sort of waging a war inside, even as he's trying to prevent a war outside. Part of it was based on one of my favorite gigs I did when I was doing fight choreography was in London, in England, and it was a production of Richard III, um, which if for those who most people I think have at least heard of Richard III, but if they haven't seen it, Richard III was a character who was largely reviled in history. He was portrayed as having like a stooped back and being this guy who murdered these two princes and was callous and evil and all the things we hate. But this production, they wanted to do a more historically truthful one. And of course, Richard III wasn't, a monster. He was, like most people, sort of a complicated character. Um, and in the classic sort of plays of Richard III, Henry Tudor is kind of portrayed as a hero at the end. Um, but in real life probably wasn't. And so uh, what I enjoyed with Play of Shadows was drawing on that notion where everyone in this world, in this fantasy world, believes that Prince Pierzi was the great hero, who saved everyone, and Archduke Corbier was this evil guy with black hair and red eyes, and that he, must have sold his soul to a demon, and that he murdered these two children, and all these kind of things. And so, as the story in the present of this sort of fantasy world unfolds, with all of these mysterious forces at work trying to take over, Damelas and these actors are discovering that something that really happened in the past, in the historical past, is that the lie that was told then is now coming home to roost in the present.
Interesting. So we were on a panel together about monsters and how monsters can be gray, and it really, depending on your view or your lens, is this person a villain or a monster or not, or is this character being a villain or a monster or not? So, and the people in your society believe that the actors can channel this. Do they trust all the information that they get, or do they think they can, or does your main character, Damalak, does he ever doubt that what he's getting is the truth?
Well, the interesting thing is, so he often questions what he's seeing, but and so the some of the fun moments to write, and hopefully for readers when they're reading the book to enjoy, are the scenes where Damelas is on stage trying to perform according to the script that's being written, in which they're trying to sort of assuage the concerns of the city, that they're not, that this theater group are not actually insurrectionists who are trying to like upend history. But even as he's trying to put on that performance, he's slipping back and forth into the past. And so he's seeing what really happened. And so he's having to adjust on stage, and his fellow actors are having to improvise so that what he's saying and doing somehow makes sense. But he and the reader are basically sliding between these two worlds and trying to figure out what the truth really is. What I thought was kind of interesting about that points to what your question is about, of the notion of, do people believe that it's real? Is what he's seeing real? One of the things I found important about that when I was writing this book is how much that question reflects on the world we live in now. So our politics now, not to dive into politics, of course, but often our society we will have these sort of stories about things. Who really, did this thing in the past, or who's responsible for this event, or whatever. And we will argue over it, even when it's very apparent that we either A, don't know the answer, or the answer is actually not the one that we're giving. And we've come to treat stories as political assets, right? And for me, I think this became really pronounced to me. Of all things, I'm Canadian, of course, so I shouldn't be too focused on American politics, but I find American politics are very story driven, so I'm always kind of compelled by them. But way back in 2004, when John Kerry was running for president, regardless of what somebody feels about John Kerry or George Bush, he'd had this record of having served quite, one would have to say, honorably in the military. And then all of a sudden, when that was politically inconvenient for people, this story sort of emerged. Oh no, he wasn't really where he said he was, or that it was all, this was a lie, or that was a lie. And the story became this kind of bludgeon for people to attack each other with, in the same way that sort of stories about George Bush. Did he really was he really there for duty and the Texas Air National Guard, or was he not there? And the way that people use those stories, when you look back on it now, you quickly see that for the most part, the people who were using that stories against their opponents didn't care one way or another whether it was true or not, right?
Yeah.
It's just a story, and the story becomes, in a way, just a vehicle for saying what you don't like about somebody. Like, did people really question whether Barack Obama was born in Hawaii or not, or was it just that became a really convenient way of saying, I don't like this guy, I don't like what he stands for, I don't like what he's doing, in the same way that, now when you see with Donald Trump, there are things that are serious things that get adjudicated in courts about him, but then there'll be stories, random stories about, events in Russia or something, for which, for the most part, we have no evidence, but people almost don't care, right? They just want the story as a tool to hurt other people with. And so that was something that was very prominent here, is the realization in this world of Play of Shadows that a lot of the stories that people treat as like, this is the foundation of our society, um, it they don't care whether the story is real or not. They just don't want anyone to take away the power that story gives them. It's almost as if somebody said today, I think most people know that the story of George Washington admitting that he chopped down a cherry tree or whatever is apocryphal. Um, but if somebody said, oh, George Washington was, dealing weed after school or something, in the 18th century, um, people would resent that story. They wouldn't want to know if the story was true or not, right? And they would even if people knew for sure it was true, some people would say it wasn't, and even if they knew for sure it wasn't true, some people would say it was true. So that's something that I think we wrestle with, and so it was nice for me to be able to explore that in a fantasy novel a little bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you're right. I mean, the stories and what we perpetuate is what we want people to believe. And everybody has their individual slant on whatever happened. So this is book one of how many in the series?
The Court of Shadows is a 4-book series. There's actually a book that's come out, that's a what we called it a prelude. It's not a prequel, called Crucible of Chaos. And the way this series works, it's a little different from a traditional fantasy series, which tends to be one big story chopped into books. And so you get to the end of one book and you're like, now I have to wait until the next book is out. I don't really enjoy that much as a reader. So as a writer, I wanted each story to be complete. It's a complete novel. They're big stories, and you get to the end and you're at the end of the novel. And they are interlinked, as part of this cycle of fantasy novels about these events going on in this country that is under threat from shadowy forces
Okay.
that they don't yet understand. And so each one, so for example, Crucible is a kind of almost a supernatural mystery story taking place on this monastery, this island that gets separated from the mainland by floods. And it's featuring one of my favorite characters, Estevar Burros, who's kind of like, I liken him to a sort of a swashbuckling Hercule Poirot meets Fox Mulder from the X-Files, but in this sort of fantasy world. Whereas Play of Shadows, of course, is Damalas, who's the grandson of two famous magistrates who's struggling to sort of not not end up in a judicial duel that's going to kill him. And so you can read the books in kind of whatever order you want. And if you love one book, but you don't feel like you know, want to read the next one, you don't have to. So
Interesting.
whereas with my first series, The Great Coats, which began with Trader's Blade, which was my debut novel, you know, that was, even though each book was complete, that was more traditional fantasy in that you would read all four books in that order. But since they're all already released, then people can do that, so it's okay.
Yeah, fun. Yeah, I think that a lot of readers like to have a complete series before they even start because waiting is hard. It's a real problem.
Oh no,
Um,
yeah, that's starting to actually, sorry, not to interject, but
yeah, okay.
that's starting to actually have very adverse effects in our artistic communities. And the first place it started with was with comics. So because people would, you know, because comic publishers would start a new series about, I don't know, some superhero or something, and then people would buy, you know, the first issue and the second issue and the third issue, and then the publishers would decide, oh, it's not popular enough, so they'd cancel it. And so people would be left hanging. And so, and as I was a comic reader as a kid, so I remember that was a pretty normal thing to happen. And what ended up happening was people go, well, I'm only going to buy them when they're in the collected editions. So when it's like, you know, 6 issues bound together in a sort of a thicker book. But then that meant that it was almost impossible to try new comics out. And then it's happened with TV, where the streaming services like Netflix would go, you know what, to get around this, we're going to film all 12 episodes of a season and release it all at once so people can binge watch. But we're with shows where people like network shows where they don't buy 12 at once, they buy a pilot, for example. And that's something I'm always aware of because I have two series, both the Great Coats and my Spellslinger series have been optioned for film and TV. And so the producers who've optioned that, they have to go out there and they have to try to convince, you know, these studios and streamers to put in a huge, like huge amounts of money to put together a fantasy TV show, with that full awareness that if you put out a great pilot, it could be the best pilot on the planet and nobody's going to watch it because they're going to go, I'll wait until it's had 3 seasons.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the tricky thing. And now in publishing, in fantasy publishing, was for the longest time it was all about trilogies and then it was all about quartets. And now for the first time since I've been in this business, which admittedly is only about a decade, publishers are starting to go, no, no, what we want are standalones. Like we want a standalone novel with what they call series potential.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Fun. So A Court of Shadows is the series that Play of Shadows is in, as well as Crucible Chaos. In the end, will you have a book that brings together all the stories so that like all the different ones make sense in the world?
Yeah, no, well, they all make sense individually, and the way that they all make sense together is you get traces in each book of characters who aren't the central character, but are kind of weaving their way through the rest of the series,
Okay.
and who are the ones who are trying to figure out kind of what's going on, why these different threats are appearing in different places. And there's two reasons I wanted to do that. One of which is, um, in our own world today, we often think of one, we always tend to try to think of one major threat. Like who is somebody's trying to destroy us, and where are they coming from? Well, they're over here and they're fighting with tanks and things like that. But of course, wars don't work that way anymore. The way that, for example, Russia over the last few years, or decades, I guess a couple of decades, I guess you could say, their sort of whole thing has been, don't fight the war until you've already defeated the enemy, right? Like basically undermine, use all these things where people won't even be aware of it, and undermine those countries until they're at such a disadvantage that you may not even have to defeat them. So for example, people always get sort of caught up in, you know, Russian interference in US elections, but it's not just US elections, there's elections in other parts of the world. And here in Canada, we recently had a bit of a scandal of discovery that I believe it's China has been trying to get involved in our elections at very low, like small levels, like the levels of individual members of ridings for members of parliament. And And so people will go, oh, well, who are they trying to get elected? Who are the Russians trying to get? Are they trying to get, Donald Trump elected or Kamala Harris elected? And but what people often don't know is that um, from the standpoint of a foreign power, they almost don't care. What they want is Americans to not trust whoever gets elected,
Oh,
right?
interesting.
Is
Yeah.
to feel that whoever got elected was not elected legitimately. That's victory. Not It's not whether it's one person necessarily the other. They might have a preference. I would assume that they do, but if you can just make a country hate itself, that's a much easier opponent to defeat. And so, with in the context of the sort of fantasy world of Tristia with the Court of Shadows books, what they are wrestling with, in a way, what the heroes in the various books are wrestling with, is kind of what wish we were wrestling with, which is where are all the threats? What is like, don't just look for one big threat to get upset about. Figure out, why are these things all happening in different areas all at once, and put that together. And the second aspect of why I wanted to write it this way is, and when I first conceived of the series, which was back in 2017, I quite liked what Marvel was doing with their cinematic universe, where they would give you these individual superhero stories, complete movies. You could watch the Captain America movie, and you didn't feel like like you had to wait for the second movie or the first Iron Man movie. You didn't feel like you were missing something out. And then they would bring them all together in a sort of an Avengers movie. And I thought,
Right.
well, that's a fun way to do a fantasy novel where you have different heroes that we're getting to be with and introduced to in each of the books. And then we have like a capstone book, a kind of a climactic book where they all come together, and we get to watch those heroes work together and fight together as they're trying to sort of sort out the problems affecting their country.
That's really interesting because I feel like romance series do that a lot, where they have, well, and I did that in my romance series. So I have a town and all these characters are related in that they attended the same college. So then I tell a romance of each of the different characters. So they're basically standalone books, but all these characters weave in and throughout all the books, which is a little bit how the superhero world is going. And it sounds like maybe what you're creating here.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice, I think it's a nice alternative to the kind of the epic that we're often accustomed to in a lot of genres of fiction, where you have a series. It took me forever, by the way, to understand that that's how romance series work, because I remember as an outsider from that space thinking, I don't get it. How do you like, how do they keep falling in love all the time? Do they fall in love with different people? I literally once went, I guess if I was going to write a fantasy romance series, it would have to be like about an elf maiden, because who kind of is immortal, so that her husbands just keep dying, and that's how she's. And then somebody sort of explained it to me, using the example of a ranch romance, where in a way, part of what's drawing readers is both the romantic aspects, but also I love this idea of ranch life. And so, yeah, you're meeting different people within that interesting world, who are falling in love. And I got hooked on Bridgerton a little bit, which
Okay.
so now I sort of understand it better. Where you're like, oh, this is nice, because characters who aren't falling in love in this season, they probably will fall in love in a subsequent season, and in that subsequent season, I get to see some of the characters I liked from the first season, even though they're
Right.
not the prime focus. So I finally understand it.
Well, they're not always like that. I mean, there are some series that the person just keeps getting with someone and breaking up and getting with someone, and but that, like, after two seasons, I'm like, no, I'm done. I can't. There's only so many times you can see the same person make the same mistake. So
No, that's true. I think Outlander, which it's treated as very much historical romance or fantasy romance, but of course is it's as much a historical adventure or fantasy adventure as it is a romance. You're not always your primary concern each season is not, will Claire and Jamie get together or stay together. Sometimes there's other things going on. But those are, yeah, but to me those are kind of almost deviations from in the Philippa Gregory books. I think are the same. Like they're not what we would think of as sort of category romance, which has its own kind of art form as to, how, you have to make all those pieces really, really good. Like and forgive me for using terms probably poorly, but like the meet cute, and these sort of things. Each of those has to be done really, really well, or for the book to work. Whereas when you're going, well, actually, it's kind of like a sweeping historical drama, but there's a big romance in it. The meet cute doesn't have to be amazing necessarily because you've got all these other things going on. It's sort of the same with fantasy, where um, in a sort of a bigger or broader sort of fantasy, you can afford to have it's not all about whether you love this particular character because there's a lot of other things going on. Whereas if you're in a certain subgenres of fantasy like progression fantasy or lit RPG or things like that, where what readers love are the mechanics of how people become different levels of spellcaster, that has to be done incredibly well.
Right. That's a whole nother
Yeah.
world building level, probably. So are your books YA or are they adult?
So I write both. So the Greatcoats, so Traitor's Blade, Knight's Shadow, Saint's Blood, and Tyrant's Throne, my first four books, those are adult swashbuckling fantasy. They're for people who love, The Princess Bride, but it's a bit of a darker world, or The Three Musketeers. I think when I sold that series, we sold it as The Three Musketeers meets Game of Thrones,
Oh,
um, which made it much much easier to sell. I have a two YA series. Sorry, I'm just reaching for one of the books here, so for the people who are watching on video can see. Um, it's called Spellslinger, and Spellslinger is a young adult fantasy series.
okay.
And it's a six-book series about a young guy named Kellen who is from a very magically oriented society. His parents are great mages. His younger sister is the most promising mage of their generation. All he's ever wanted to be is a mage, and he begins the book ready to take his trials, only to discover that his magic is fading. And luckily for him, he meets a woman named Farius Parfax, who's the person on the other side of the cover, who's part of what are called the Argosi, who are people who this order of people who kind of use human abilities, things that belong to all of us: music, eloquence, dance, martial arts, and they take those to such a level of sophistication, kind of out trick wizards and mages and monsters and everything else. And so I love that series because it so much represents what it was like for me as a teenage boy. Like when I was 16, I did not discover that I was the chosen one, or I had unbelievable talents that other people didn't have, or that I was secretly rich, or that my parents secretly loved me more than everyone else. I discovered that I was kind of ordinary. And I was lucky that I had people around me who said, instead of saying, no, 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 you're so special, Sebastien, or I didn't have that. I had people around me who said, yeah, no, you're not that special. You're an ordinary kid. What are you going to do about it? Which kind of led me to try to learn different things and find different things in life and different sources of wonder to kind of put those all together to try to make myself into an interesting person. And so Spellslinger is a six-book series. There's lots of fun. There's a murderous talking squirrel cat. Um, uh, and also there's the Argosy series, which is a spin-off, which is about Farius Parfax when she was a young woman and how she became an Argosy, because I get letters from all over the world. Every week I get letters from people saying, how do I become an Argosy? And um, which I cannot answer for people, but the stories kind of show what I've learned over time, and hopefully people enjoy it and find useful in that sense. And
That's
then,
fun.
and my latest series is called Malevolent Seven, which is every fantasy writer eventually wants to write the Magnificent Seven, but with wizards. So it's a little bit like the Magnificent Seven, but with wizards blowing things up and swearing constantly. So if you don't like
Fun.
foul language, stay away from that one.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that on our panel. It sounded like a lot of fun. So,
It is. The latest one is I'm writing the sequel right now. And again, I had not intended, and this I think points to how the publishing industry is working right now. I had not intended to write a sequel, although I knew that there was potential for there to be a sequel. I had not intended to publish the first book. The first book was published as a standalone by my publishers, who were like, well, this looks like fun. Let's see. And then it just happened to, I think it outsold its sales targets by 400% for its 1 year sales targets, by outsold by 400% in the first 6 months. And so they went, we really think this needs a sequel or two. So now we'll have a sequel with a vampire kangaroo in it.
Okay, so I have to say at this point that even though you thought there was nothing special about you at age 16, I'm guessing a little bit of this was there at the beginning.
No, I came by whatever talents I have, honestly, in the sense that, you know, look, I will tell you this. This is absolutely true. So a little over 10 years ago, after I'd already written my first novel, but before I had a book deal, I remember I was working at Vancouver's film school. It's an entertainment school in Vancouver. It's one of the longest running in the world. It's been around for about 30 years. And I loved working there. I loved the people. And I remember I was sitting in a meeting. I was the director of strategic program development, which is I was the one whose job was to help the programs kind of develop themselves over time, like to keep adapting to a changing industry. And we were talking about curriculum, and I remember one of the department heads who was for a program was talking to me, and we were talking about the art of what they did, and he sort of said, "Well, look, you should probably stick to the PowerPoints, like making spreadsheets and stuff, because they didn't have a clear sense of what it was that I did, which is fine. I'm not sure I did either." But he said, and very nicely, he said, you wouldn't identify yourself as an artist, right? Like you wouldn't think of yourself as a creative person. And I said, well, I don't know, like, I guess, maybe. Um, and now, I've traveled all over the world. My books have been published into 15 different languages. I've had 2 series optioned for film and TV. I've had this wonderful career that's entirely based on my creativity, my ability to be an artist. And I say that um, because there most of my life nobody would have ever said, "Oh yeah, that guy's an artist." They would have
I
said anything but
yeah.
that.
I get that because I didn't think I was a creative person either. I started my career in science and technology and biotech. And what I realized once I like truly embraced that I love writing and love writing fantasy, especially, is that because I was a researcher, what I loved most about doing the research was like how to craft the experiment to get the answer I wanted. I mean, I cared about the answer, obviously, because that led us to the next answer or whatever we were doing, or a yes or a no, or what direction we were going in. But what I would get excited about when I was taking my shower in the morning was, oh, how do I figure out this next thing? What experiment do I do? How do I set up the experiment? How do I create it? What questions do I ask? And that's what excited me about going to work. It wasn't the yes or no or whatever we were getting at the end. And really, that's what I do now. Like I sit in the shower and say, okay, how do I get my, um, you know, how do I get my characters from point A to point B in a creative, fun way? And that's what I want to do in my life, right? So,
Yeah, I think we have I think as a society we've tended to have a really narrow view of creativity, and and what it kind of means and why it's interesting. In that, my brother-in-law, in addition to being an entrepreneur of various kinds, also, is a plumber. And when I've had the benefit of getting to watch him work, you see how creative that process is of coming up with these sort of interesting ways of solving things. And it's not just purely solving it. There's always an element of, this is a better way of doing this. This is how people should sort of do this, and this is what will work best for your house and what's going on. And there's a lot of creativity. The difference is, as an author, our the material that we're working with tends to be words, and it tends to be, stories that are articulated in words rather than stories that are articulated in as the structure of a science experiment, or the structure of, or the architecture of a house, or so we all sort of have it. And I think, as you say, like both you and I, or, now this is what we do, is write novels. Lots of people would have said, oh no, they're not, they're more technical sort of people, or they're more this kind of business people, or they're more this. And I think it's important to recognize that, because so many of your listeners, for example, might be people who deep down have great books to write and stories to tell, but they don't fit the profile of what does a creative person look like. Like, maybe, I don't know, they're not hippie enough or something. Um, but those things are irrelevant, right? It's whether, you look for a story inside you, and you look for the best way to tell it that you can, and you put yourself on the page, and sometimes the magic comes out.
That's who I talk to. I talk to so many different people from so many different walks of life. Now I'm like, no, there's not one person who is an author or writer or creator or not. So it's
Mhm.
all different across the board. So it's
Yeah.
really fun. So tell us what's coming up next for you, where we can find you, and all those fun things.
Yeah. So what's next for me? So I'm working on the sequel to Malevolent 7, which is creatively titled at the moment Malevolent 8, which is coming out next late spring, I think in May. Our Lady of Blades, which is the book I've been spending. Our Lady of Blades is one of my favorite books to be writing. First of all, because I've never worked so hard on anything in my entire life, and it's the most intricate thing. Like I'm writing this book. Like for me, this book is going to be like my intricate masterpiece. And I swear, by the time it's published, people will say, "Oh, it's great. It's a nice light fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously." You know what I mean? Like you put all the work into the kind of the clockwork of a book to make all these intricate things happen, and then often when it works, people will see it as, oh yeah, it's just a fun story.
You're like,
So
no,
that
no, no, no. Look at all these little points that had to come together.
I'm sure you've had this too. That's one of the things I find the most interesting, especially with my debut, Trader's Blade, because it's a very swashbuckling marine novel. And I will meet two kinds of people when I'm at conventions or doing signings and people come up. There are the people who go, "This was just so much fun. I really loved Three Musketeers," or "I love Princess Bride," blah, blah, blah. And then there's the people who come up to you and they almost can't speak. They're like trying so hard to find the words to tell you what this book meant to them because they're reading it in a different way. They're reading in the book the things that made me want to write the book. And so
Right.
I always love those encounters, even when they're incredibly awkward for the reader who is sort of struggling to say what they want to say. So I love that. But in terms of so yeah, so two books on the schedule for next year. There will probably be a big announcement in the coming months about another book that I can't quite talk about yet, but is pretty exciting. Um, and in terms of finding me, my books are sort of everywhere, the usual, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, your local bookstore, your local library, that kind of stuff. They're in 15 different languages. So if you, really like reading in, I don't know, Russian or Hebrew or Czech, you can often find them there in those languages. And in terms of finding me, the best place to find me is on my website, which is www.decastell.com, just DECASTELL.com. If you type my name into a search engine, you'll find me pretty easily.
Great.
And yeah,
Yeah, we'll have
I have a
all the links
contact
in the
page.
description too. So
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I have a contact page there and I reply to every single email I get.
fun. What struck me when you were talking about, I've done this intricate thing and somebody thinks it looks easy is like, well, the experts always make it look easy, right? But, I mean, the marathon runner makes running look really easy. So maybe that's your gift.
That would be lovely if that was my gift. Right now, my gift is I bang my head against the keyboard repeatedly until eventually writing actual words becomes a sense of relief from the pain.
Well, I wish you the best of luck and please come back when you release your new novel.
Thanks so much, Trisha.
Bye. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.